There is a particular kind of silence that falls over a room when a marriage ends. Not the silence of peace, not the silence of rest, but the silence of something irreversible, something that has been decided, sealed, and set into motion whether you are ready for it or not. It is the silence that follows a door closing in a hallway you both shared. The silence after 12 years of a life, 12 years of mornings and dinners and arguments and laughter, and late nights and quiet Sundays, all reduced to a stack of papers on a marble table in a glass tower in Midtown Manhattan. That is where this story begins, not with shouting, not with tears, with silence and a pen and a woman who understood in that moment that the most powerful thing she would ever do was smile. Her name was Elena Cross, though for 12 years she had answered to a different name. For 12 years she had been Elena Holt, wife of Daniel Holt, a man who had built his entire identity around the belief that he was the most important person in every room he entered. Daniel was the kind of man who wore his confidence like a second suit, pressed and deliberate and impossible to ignore. He was charming in the way that a well-rehearsed performance is charming, smooth and certain, and always exactly on cue. He had built a career in commercial real estate acquisitions, had his name on 3 buildings in Lower Manhattan, and had cultivated a social circle that treated proximity to wealth like a kind of currency. And for 12 years, Elena had stood beside him in that world, had attended the dinners and the charity galas and the firm anniversary parties, and had quietly, almost invisibly, made every single one of those events run without a flaw. Before we go any further, let us know in the comments where you are watching from. We would love to hear from you. And please do not forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. What people rarely understood about Elena, what Daniel himself had chosen not to understand because it was more comfortable not to, was that she was not simply decorative. She had graduated with honors from Georgetown University with a degree in urban planning and design. She had spent the first 2 years of her career working for a mid-sized real estate development firm in Washington, D.C., where her supervisors had praised her instincts for land use, her ability to see opportunity in places other analysts passed over, and her extraordinary patience in negotiations. She had been, by every measure, on the path to something significant. And then she had met Daniel Holt at a conference in Chicago, and everything had shifted in the slow, almost imperturbable way that a river changes course. Not all at once. Degree by degree, season by season, until one day you look up and realize you are somewhere entirely different from where you started. Daniel had swept her into his orbit with the kind of focused attention that, when directed at you, feels like being chosen. He remembered details. He called when he said he would call. He told her, early and often, that she was remarkable, that he had never met anyone like her, that the life they could build together would be extraordinary. And Elena, who was 28 years old and brilliant, and perhaps more accustomed to being underestimated than she had ever fully admitted to herself, had believed him. She had left D.C., she had moved to New York. She had married Daniel Holt on a warm September afternoon, in a ceremony that his mother had largely organized, in a venue that his family had largely chosen, surrounded by a guest list that skewed heavily toward people who mattered to Daniel's career. And Elena had stood at that altar and seen not a warning but a beginning. The first years were good, or at least they contained enough goodness to feel real. They traveled. They entertained. Elena threw herself into the life of a woman married to a man of Daniel's ambitions, and she was extraordinary at it. She had an eye for design that transformed their penthouse on the Upper West Side into something that appeared in 2 separate architecture publications. She had a warmth with people that made every dinner party feel effortless, the kind of effortless that actually requires an enormous amount of invisible labor. She managed their household with the same precision she would have brought to a project proposal, handled the contractors and the caterers and the calendar and the correspondence, and did all of it without ever once asking for credit, because that was not the kind of woman she was. She did things because they needed doing. She did them well because she did not know how to do anything otherwise. But somewhere around year 4, something began to shift in Daniel. Success, when it arrives in large enough quantities, has a way of revealing a person's worst inclinations. Daniel began to talk over her at dinners. It was subtle at first, the kind of thing you might chalk up to enthusiasm, to the momentum of a good story. He would cut across something she was saying to redirect the conversation, and he would do it so smoothly that neither of them would acknowledge it in the moment. But it happened again and again. And over months and years it accumulated into a pattern that Elena recognized, even if she never named it aloud. She was being made smaller, incrementally, expertly, in ways that left no fingerprints. He began handling all of their finances. He framed it as a kindness, as one less thing for her to manage, because she was already doing so much, he said. He said it warmly and she accepted it. But what that arrangement also meant was that Elena had no independent access to the accounts, no clear picture of what they had, no foothold in the financial reality of her own life. She was given a household card and a monthly allowance for personal expenses that Daniel tracked. He never said anything harsh about her spending. He simply always knew what she had spent. And knowing that he knew changed the way she moved through even the smallest purchases in ways that she would not fully understand until much later. She had tried, during those middle years, to return to professional work. She had floated the idea of joining a design consultancy. Daniel had listened carefully and then explained, with great reasonableness, why the timing was difficult, why her value to their household was irreplaceable, why the disruption to their routine would create stress they didn't need right now. He never said no, he just made yes feel impossible. And Elena, who was perceptive about almost everything except what was happening to her, would table the conversation and return to the rhythms of the life she had agreed to maintain. By year 8, she had begun to feel the edges of something she could only describe as a slow erosion. Not of love, necessarily, because she was not certain what she felt for Daniel anymore was love in the way she had understood the word at 28. What she felt was familiar. What she felt was the weight of a life she had built around a person who had quietly, systematically discouraged her from building anything of her own. She felt the particular exhaustion of a woman who is competent at everything she does and acknowledged for none of it, whose intelligence is treated as a convenience rather than a presence, whose ideas are absorbed without attribution, and whose silences are mistaken for contentment. In year 10, she had started writing things down, not a journal exactly, more like a record. Numbers she had noticed, patterns she had observed, ideas that kept returning to her, quiet and persistent, about properties she had walked past in neighborhoods that were just beginning to shift, about development opportunities that Daniel's firm had overlooked or dismissed. She wrote them in a notebook she kept in the back of her closet, behind her summer clothes, in a space that was entirely hers. She did not know exactly why she kept it hidden. She told herself it was because the ideas were half-formed. She would come to understand later that she had already known, somewhere below the level of conscious thought, that she was preparing for something. The divorce did not arrive as an explosion. That was perhaps the most quietly devastating part of it. There was no single catastrophic event, no dramatic confrontation, no moment when everything cracked open and the truth came flooding out. There was, instead, a Tuesday evening in November when Daniel had come home from a dinner she had not been invited to, set his coat on the chair she had asked him 100 times not to use for his coat, poured himself a drink, and told her, with the same calm efficiency with which he might discuss a contract clause, that he thought they had run their course. He used that phrase, run their course. As though their marriage were a subscription service, he had simply decided not to renew. He explained, been seeing someone. Her name was Vanessa. She was 29 years old, worked in marketing, and had been a part of his world for the better part of 8 months. He had not been careless about it. He had, if anything, been organized. He had already spoken to his attorney. The papers were being prepared. He was prepared to be generous, he said, and he meant the word the way people mean it when they intend to control the terms entirely. He wanted the penthouse. He would keep the accounts. He would provide a settlement that he described as fair, though he was the one who had decided what fair looked like. Elena had sat across from him and listened. She had not cried. She had not raised her voice. She had felt something cold and clarifying move through her, the way a window feels when you throw it open in winter, the shock of it, the cleanness of it. She had thought, in that moment, of her notebook in the closet. She had thought of the ideas she had been writing down for 2 years. She had thought of every dinner party she had organized, every deal of his she had heard, discussed, and quietly improved upon, every year of her own potential that she had set aside in a drawer and kept there because the timing was never quite right. And she had made a decision so fast and so complete that it surprised even her. She said, keep it, all of it. Daniel had blinked. He had expected negotiation. He had perhaps even expected tears. He had prepared for resistance and had calibrated his offer accordingly. The absence of resistance confused him. He asked if she understood what she was agreeing to. She said she understood perfectly. She signed the separation agreement 3 weeks later and began the formal divorce proceedings. She did not hire the kind of attorney who fights for every asset. She hired the kind who moves quickly and cleanly, who understood that she did not want Daniel's penthouse or Daniel's accounts or Daniel's art collection or any of the material architecture of a life that had slowly, carefully been built in his image and not hers. What she kept was her name, which she immediately restored to Cross. She kept the $40,000 she had set aside over the years from the household funds in increments. So small Daniel had never noticed them, because he was meticulous about large things and careless about small ones. She kept her Georgetown degree and the 10 years of industry knowledge she had accumulated simply by being in proximity to the work and refusing, even when no one was watching, to stop thinking. She kept her notebook, and she walked out of that marriage with exactly what she had arrived with, plus a clarity of purpose that she had never once felt standing beside Daniel Holt. The signing of the final divorce papers took place on a Friday morning in March. The conference room was on the 14th floor of a glass tower in Midtown Manhattan. Daniel had arrived first, which was his habit. He had brought his attorney and his best friend from college, a man named Troy Ellison, who served as witness and, more importantly, as audience. Daniel had always needed an audience. He had arranged the papers with the efficiency of a man who has rehearsed the moment in his mind and is satisfied with how it looks. When Elena walked in, accompanied only by her own attorney, he had allowed himself a small, private expression that was not quite a smirk but was adjacent to one. He had slid the papers across the marble table and said, "Sign here and here. And don't forget to smile when you do it." It was meant to sting. It was the last move in a performance that had been running for years, the final reminder that he was in control of the terms, that she was a participant in a story he had authored. And Elena had looked at him across that table, and she had signed and she had smiled, and the smile had been real, which he did not expect, which he also did not understand. Because what Daniel Holt could not see, from where he was sitting, was what Elena Cross was smiling about. She was not smiling because she was defeated. She was not smiling because she had accepted the terms or made peace with the outcome, or found some performance of grace that would let her leave with dignity intact. She was smiling because she could already see, with absolute precision, exactly what she was going to build. She walked out of that glass tower and she did not look back once. The first month after the divorce, Elena moved into a one-bedroom apartment in a part of Brooklyn that had not yet arrived but was very clearly on its way. She had chosen it deliberately, because she knew what arriving looked like before it happened. She had been watching neighborhoods for years. This one had the bones. It had the transit access and the rezoning proposals and the quiet influx of small creative businesses that always preceded the larger shift. She paid her rent with careful precision, and she ate modestly, and she set up her workspace at the kitchen table with a laptop and the notebook from her closet and a list of contacts she had cultivated over 12 years at her husband's side, people who had shaken her hand at dinners and respected her intelligence even when Daniel had not credited it publicly. She did not tell anyone what she was building, not yet. She registered the company, Cross Build Ventures, from a desk she rented for $200 a month in a shared workspace in Lower Manhattan. She had researched the cost of shared workspaces extensively before choosing. She had researched everything extensively. She had spent the months before the divorce was finalized reading every document she could access about small business formation, about commercial real estate development financing, about the specific regulatory environment for development projects in the 5 boroughs. She read at night, after Daniel had gone to sleep, on her phone with the brightness turned low. She had been preparing longer than even she had fully acknowledged. The first project Elena brought to completions was a small mixed-use building in the neighborhood she had moved to in Brooklyn. It was not a glamorous project. It was a former auto repair shop on a corner lot that had been sitting vacant for 3 years, because the owner was an elderly man in Florida whose children disagreed about what to do with it. Elena had found the property through city records, had traced the ownership to the family, had spent 4 months corresponding with the estate attorney before getting a call back, and had then spent 2 more months patiently building a relationship with the owner's daughter, a woman named Carol who had her own misgivings about developers and needed to be persuaded not by aggression but by evidence of genuine care for what the space might become. Elena had that conversation with the focus and the warmth of someone who actually meant what she was saying, because she did. She proposed a mixed-use development that would include affordable studio space for artists on the upper 2 floors and retail on the ground floor. She had done the financing projections herself, had secured a small business development loan, and had brought in 2 investors she knew from the world she had left, both of whom had been waiting for an opportunity to invest with someone they trusted. The project came in on time and under budget. The building, when it opened, was reviewed in a neighborhood real estate publication. Elena Cross was named, not Elena Holt, not Daniel Holt's ex-wife. Elena Cross, founder of Cross Build Ventures, who had identified the opportunity, secured the financing, managed the development timeline, and delivered a property that the neighborhood responded to with something close to genuine gratitude. She read that small review at her kitchen table on a Tuesday morning with a cup of coffee, and she sat with it for a long time before she allowed herself to feel what it was. It was not pride exactly, though pride was part of it. It was recognition. The experience of being seen doing something that was entirely incontestably hers. By the end of her first full year in business, Cross Build Ventures had completed 2 projects and had a third in negotiation. By the end of the second year, she had moved the company out of the shared workspace and into a small dedicated office in Lower Manhattan, hired an assistant named Priya, who was 24 years old and startlingly efficient, and had begun the conversations that would eventually lead to her first international acquisition discussion, a development partnership with a firm that operated across the eastern seaboard and had been interested in expanding their New York footprint for years. Elena had met their principals at an industry conference, where she had been invited to speak on a panel about neighborhood-scale development. She had spoken without notes. The principals had found her afterward. That was how it tended to go with Elena Cross. People found her afterward. Daniel Holt, during this same period, had married Vanessa Rhodes in the fall. The engagement had been announced in a way that felt designed to be seen, a photograph on a social platform that Elena's former social circle had inevitably shared. A vacation proposal in Tuscany, a ring that made several columns in the lifestyle press. Daniel had moved Vanessa into the penthouse on the Upper West Side and had continued his professional life in the way it had always operated, with volume and surface confidence and an inner circle that reflected his preferred version of events back at him. He told the story of his first marriage in the way that served him best. Elena had never recovered from the divorce. Some women, he would say with a slight rueful shake of the head, just could not handle losing. He said it so often and so consistently that it began to feel true to him and to the people who heard it, and perhaps most significantly to Vanessa, who had heard a version of it on their third date and who had responded with the wide, sympathetic eyes of a woman who had not yet had reason to question what she was being told. The invitation arrived on a Tuesday, 9 months before the wedding. Cream-colored cardstock with gold-embossed lettering, delivered by courier to the Cross Build Ventures offices on the 31st floor of a building in Midtown Manhattan, because Daniel had gotten the address from a mutual acquaintance and had chosen to use it deliberately. The address itself was a statement he was willing to make, which meant he had done the minimum of research on her, which meant he had discovered the office existed, but not the scope of what had grown inside it. He had discovered enough to know she had a company. He had not discovered enough to understand what the company had become. Priya had brought the envelope in on a small silver tray with the day's correspondence, and Elena had opened it with the same methodical attention she brought to all of her mail, slicing the seal cleanly with a letter opener she had received as a gift from a client in Geneva. She had read the front panel, the formal invitation language, the names, the venue, the date, and then she had turned it over and read the handwritten note on the back in the handwriting she knew better than almost any other in the world. "I thought you should see what moving on looks like." She had set the card down on her desk. She had picked up her coffee mug. She had set it back down without drinking from it. And then she had been very still for a long moment, in the way that a person is still when they are experiencing something privately that they do not intend to share with the room. Priya, who was perceptive in the way of young people who have paid careful attention to the adults around them, leaned over and read the card twice. She said with perfect economy, "That's bold." Elena said very quietly, "That's Daniel." And then she turned the card over again and read the note one more time, and something settled over her face that Priya would later describe when she told the story as a kind of quiet decision, not anger, not satisfaction, something more complete than either of those things. Elena set down her mug. She reached for her phone. She called Marcus, her head of security, who had been with her for 2 years and who had developed in that time a precise understanding of every version of Elena Cross. This version, still in focused and entirely resolved, was the version he had learned to pay the closest attention to. She said, "Marcus, clear my Saturday." He said, "Yes, ma'am," and did not ask why, because he understood already that an explanation would arrive when it was ready and not before. The Saturday in question was the first weekend in October, and the forecast called for clear skies. Elena spent the intervening weeks preparing in the way she prepared for everything, with thoroughness and without urgency. She selected her outfit with the same consideration she brought to a development proposal, understanding that every choice of material and silhouette and accessory carried information that would be received and interpreted by others, whether she intended it or not. She chose a floor-length gown in champagne silk because champagne said celebration without effort, because silk moved in a way that commanded attention without requiring it, and because the color against her complexion was precise and correct. She wore diamonds because she had bought them herself on the day that her Geneva partners had called to confirm a valuation figure that had cleared 9 figures for the first time. And she had bought them not to display, but to remember. She did her hair with the natural texture she had spent years pressing straight because Daniel had preferred it that way, pinned now with quiet elegance, a few strands loose around her face because control and ease are not opposites if you understand what you are doing. She did not overdress. She did not wear red or black or anything that announced itself. She looked expensive in the specific way that expensive, when it is genuinely felt from the inside, requires no announcement at all. Marcus, watching her clasp the bracelet at her wrist in the anteroom of her apartment, folded his arms and told her flatly, "Don't." She asked, with studied innocence, what he meant. He said, "That face. You're doing the face." She turned from the mirror and asked what she always said, and he exhaled and repeated it back to her, because he had heard it enough times to have it memorized. "You don't go to battles. You go to conclusions." She nodded. She picked up her clutch. She said, "He wanted me to see what he built. Fair enough." She walked toward the elevator. She said, "Let's go see what I built." The Harlow estate, in the hills outside the city, was precisely as spectacular as Daniel had intended it to be. He had selected the venue the way he selected all things, for maximum visible impact, for the story it would tell about a man who had arrived somewhere definitive. Rolling green grounds, the kind that required a staff of 10 to maintain. White floral archways that cost more per arrangement than most people's monthly rent. 200 guests in their finest, because Daniel's network was extensive and his social ambitions ran high. Champagne towers, a string quartet, a private catering company that had done 2 presidential events and whose name was mentioned in the wedding program. It was a statement of a day, architected and deliberate, and it was beautiful in the way that things are beautiful when an enormous amount of money and intention has been applied to make them so. Daniel stood near the entrance receiving his guests with the smooth warmth of a man who is at ease, because he has controlled every variable within his reach. The first black SUV came through the gate at 12 minutes past 2 o'clock. Then a second, perhaps 10 seconds behind it. Then a third. All of them dark, all of them tinted, moving in a formation that was quiet and unhurried, and somehow in its quietness more arresting than if they had arrived with noise. They parked in a precise line along the drive's eastern edge, with the kind of coordination that requires prior instruction. The doors opened in sequence. 2 security personnel stepped out from the lead vehicle, both in dark suits, both with the posture of people who are paid to be alert and who have not forgotten that. 2 more emerged from the rear vehicle. They took positions without speaking, without looking at one another, without requiring any visible signal, because they had already been briefed and they understood exactly what their function was. And then the middle door opened. Elena Cross stepped out onto the gravel of the Harlow Estate Drive, and the afternoon light came down on her the way light falls on things that belong in it. She did not pause dramatically at the vehicle door. She did not survey the assembled guests from a height. She simply emerged and began to move forward, and the way she moved, with the complete physical ease of a woman who has nowhere she would rather be and nothing she needs to prove, accomplished something that no entrance she could have staged would have achieved more effectively. It drew attention in the way that genuine composure always draws attention, because it is rarer than performance and more difficult to dismiss. A woman standing near the champagne tower leaned toward her husband and asked, "Who is that?" He said he didn't know. She said she looked like someone she should know. 3 tables away, a man who recognized Elena from an industry conference in San Francisco 2 years prior said quietly to the person beside him that he believed that was the CEO of Cross Build Ventures, the real estate development firm that had just closed an international acquisition with a valuation in the 9-figure range. The person beside him said that couldn't be right, because Daniel Holt's ex-wife worked in interior design or something. The man from San Francisco said he was fairly certain. A third person at the table pulled out a phone. Daniel, standing 30 feet away by the entrance archway, had gone completely still. He was still holding a champagne flute. He became aware of the weight of it, in a way he had not been aware of it 30 seconds earlier. He watched Elena move through his garden with the ease of someone attending an event she had herself organized, and he felt the first movement of something in his chest that he did not want to name and so did not name. Vanessa appeared at his elbow and asked him something, and he answered without fully processing what she had said. Vanessa followed his gaze. She watched Elena accept a glass of sparkling water from a passing server, watched Marcus take his position 8 feet behind her, watched 3 guests approach Elena in the space of 4 minutes, all of them apparently delighted to find her there, and Vanessa said, very quietly, that Daniel's ex-wife had arrived with a security detail. Daniel said she was always dramatic. Vanessa said, "That's not drama, Daniel. That's infrastructure." Daniel's mother, Margaret Holt, found Elena near the fountain at the garden's far end. Margaret was 71 years old and had been the most perceptive person in every room she had entered for the better part of 5 decades. She had liked Elena from the beginning, had liked the intelligence behind her eyes, and the patience with which she navigated a world that was frequently unkind to intelligent women who displayed it too openly. Margaret had been quietly grieved by the divorce in a way she had not expressed to Daniel because he had not asked. She crossed the garden now with her hands folded in front of her and said Elena's name, and Elena turned and smiled at her with what appeared to Margaret to be genuine warmth. And Margaret felt the guilt she had been carrying settle more heavily for a moment before she spoke. She said, "He told people you were struggling." Elena turned her water glass slowly in her hands. She said, "People see what they expect to see." Margaret studied her. The silk, the stillness, the security detail positioned at a respectful distance, and something passed across the older woman's face that was not simple admiration, though admiration was present. It was the more complicated expression of a woman who understood, perhaps for the first time and perhaps too late, what the equation of that 12-year marriage had truly cost. Margaret said, "You've done well." Elena said, "Yes." Without qualification, without modesty, without the apologetic softening that women are trained to apply to their own achievements in order to make the people around them more comfortable. Just, yes. Then she smiled again and moved away, and Margaret stood at the fountain for a long moment with her own thoughts. Daniel made his first and only true mistake of that afternoon when he walked over to where Elena was seated. He had been watching her for the better part of an hour, and something had been building in him that he could not precisely identify. It was not regret in any simple form. It was more like the specific discomfort of a man who has built an entire narrative and is watching, from a distance, evidence accumulate that the narrative was wrong. He had told the story so many times. Elena had never recovered. She was struggling. She was the cautionary illustration of a woman who did not know how to lose with any kind of grace. He had told that story to his groomsmen, to his best man Troy, to Vanessa on their third date with a rueful shake of the head, and what he imagined was a sad kind of wisdom. He had repeated it until it felt true because repetition and truth are easily confused when you are the only one checking. He sat down across from her in the garden chair and was briefly surprised to find himself seated, as though the decision had been made before he was fully aware of making it. He looked at her. She looked at him with eyes that were entirely steady and gave him nothing to work with, no anger, no softness, no performance of either. He said her name, she said his. He started to say something about how she looked and then stopped mid-sentence because what he had been about to say was that she looked well, which was obviously true, but stating the obvious in this particular moment felt like a concession he was not prepared to make out loud. She finished the sentence for him, gently, with mild humor, the way you might help someone who has lost their place. She said, like someone who is doing well. He shifted in his chair. He said he had wanted her to come. He said he thought. He stopped. She said, "You thought it would hurt me. It was not a question." He said nothing. She said she knew. She said he had written it on the invitation. He said, "And?" His voice came out tighter than he had intended. She tilted her head slightly to one side, the way she had always done when she was thinking carefully before she spoke, and he recognized the gesture with a sudden clarity that landed somewhere between recognition and pain. She said, "I see a beautiful venue, a lovely bride who deserves better than a man who invites his ex-wife to wound her, and I see you." She paused for exactly the right amount of time, exactly where I left you. She was not saying it to injure him. That was the thing that he would not be able to stop thinking about in the hours and days that followed. It would have been easier if she had been cruel. Cruelty he could have deflected. Cruelty would have confirmed his story about her, the bitterness, the inability to move past what she had lost. But she was not cruel, she was factual. She was saying it the way you state something that is simply and demonstrably true, the way you say the temperature or name a city on a map. And because there was no cruelty in it, there was also no armor against it. He sat with it in a way he could not have sat with an attack. Troy Ellison found him afterward, walking back through the garden with his jaw set in a way that Troy had learned, over 30 years of friendship, to associate with a particular kind of internal turbulence. Troy had been watching. Troy had, in the preceding 90 minutes, done what anyone with a smartphone and a mildly activated curiosity would eventually do at an event where a woman arrives with 4 bodyguards and 3 private vehicles. He had searched Elena Cross. He had found the Forbes profile from 8 months prior. He had found the industry coverage of the international acquisition. He had found the building portfolio, the conference speaking invitations, the brief mention in a Wall Street Journal piece about emerging leaders in urban real estate development. He had held his phone and read these things, and then he had put the phone away and gone to find Daniel. He said, "You told me she never recovered from the divorce." Daniel said nothing. Troy said, "Danny, you said she was struggling." Daniel's voice when it came was very quiet. He said she was. 3 years ago. Troy looked back across the garden to where Elena was now speaking with a group of guests who appeared entirely charmed by her, and he said, "That woman has not been struggling for a very long time." Daniel stood there in the garden of the estate he had chosen for its spectacular impression, beside the wedding of which he was the groom, with the string quartet tuning behind him and the champagne towers catching the afternoon light. And he felt something shift in him in a way that was quiet and irreversible, the way the light shifts in October, the way the temperature drops between 1 hour and the next, until you cannot say precisely when it changed, but you know that it did. He pressed his eyes closed for a moment. He thought about the note he had written on the back of the invitation. He had been so certain, writing it. He had felt the power of the gesture, had imagined her reading it, had imagined the specific quality of the hurt he intended it to deliver. He could not access that certainty anymore. What he could access was the image of Elena Cross emerging from a black SUV in champagne silk with her head forward and her spine straight, and the memory of her face across the garden table, composed and direct, and without any visible remnant of the woman he had once stood across a marble table and told to sign and smile. Before the ceremony began, Elena rose from her chair. Marcus appeared at her side before she had taken a single step, with the effortless attunement of someone who had made a study of her rhythms. No word between them, no visible signal, just presence. 3 tables of guests looked up at the movement. Elena smoothed her silk, placed a small cream envelope on the table with her initials pressed into the seal in gold EC, and picked up her clutch. She moved toward the entrance of the estate with the same quality of motion she had arrived with, unhurried and entirely self-possessed, her detail flanking her at the measured distances they had held all afternoon. Guests moved out of her path before they understood why they were doing so. At the entrance arch she paused once. An older gentleman she did not know asked if she was leaving before the ceremony. She said, "I came to pay my respects. My schedule doesn't allow me to stay." He blinked. He said, "Respects? It's a wedding." She was already moving toward the cars. The 3 SUVs started in sequence. Inside the vehicle, Priya was already on the phone confirming that Elena was available for the Cape Town call on Monday and that the Paris dinner on Thursday was still on. Elena leaned her head back against the headrest and closed her eyes for several long seconds, and then she opened them and looked at the light coming through the tinted glass. And she was quiet in the way of someone who has concluded something. Daniel found the envelope after the ceremony, during the interval between the formal proceedings and the reception search, when guests was moving between spaces and the afternoon light had begun to soften into early evening gold. He had been looking for it, or rather he had known it was there, had seen Elena place it before she left, had left it untouched through the ceremony and the photographs and the first round of congratulations because he needed a moment of privacy he had not yet been able to manufacture. He found it at the table where she had been seated. He sat down alone, which required a small effort given the social momentum of the afternoon. He opened the envelope carefully, which was not how he normally opened things, and removed the single card inside. She had not written much. That was the first thing he noticed. He had half expected something comprehensive, something that covered the ground between them with the thoroughness she brought to everything. But there were 4 sentences. He read them once, he read them again. He read them a 3rd time with the slow deliberateness of a man who is making sure he is understanding correctly. She had written, "Thank you for the invitation. I hope you find in this marriage everything you were never willing to build in ours." She had written, "I forgave you a long time ago. That is why I could come." He sat with those 4 sentences for a long time. Troy found him at the table with the card in his hands, looking at it the way people look at things they have not yet decided what to do with. Troy read the expressions on Daniel's face and said the toasts were starting. Daniel folded the card with a care that was entirely foreign to his normal relationship with paper and objects, the brisk efficiency with which he processed and discarded material things. He folded it precisely in half and then in half again and put it in the inside pocket of his jacket against his chest, and he did not examine his reasons for doing so, because examining them would have required more honesty than he was prepared to access in the middle of his wedding reception. He walked back to Vanessa, who was beautiful in her gown, and who had been watching the door since Elena had left, who said something warm and celebratory as he approached and reached for his hand, and he held her hand and smiled and moved through the rest of the afternoon with the practiced ease of a man who has always understood how to appear present in a room even when his mind is somewhere entirely else. Back in Manhattan, Elena stood at the floor-to-ceiling window of her apartment and watched the city rearrange itself in the evening dark. The skyline which she had looked at every night for 2 years from this window, and which she knew in the way you come to know things that are always there, was in its usual quiet state of motion, lights going on and off across 1,000 floors, the orange-gray of the sky above it, the slow river of traffic below. Her phone had 17 messages. Partners, advisors, a journalist who wanted 30 minutes for a profile piece that would run in a monthly publication, whose readership included most of the people she would want to be aware of what Crossbuild Ventures was doing in the next fiscal year. She would answer them in order of priority beginning tomorrow morning. Tonight she stood at the window. Priya had asked on the drive back from the estate whether it had been worth going. It was a genuine question, asked without judgment, the kind of question that Priya asked because she was curious about the answer rather than because she needed to manage something. Elena had taken her time. She had watched the city come back into view through the car window, and she had thought about why she had really gone. She had told herself, in the weeks of preparation, that she was going out of genuine and uncomplicated closure, that she was a woman at peace attending an event that did not diminish her and therefore required no avoidance. That was true, but it was not the whole truth. The whole truth was that she had needed to know whether the ache was still there. The particular ache that is not love and not grief exactly, but is the residue of years, of shared mornings and familiar arguments, and the specific intimacies of knowing someone's routines and fears and preferences in detail. She had needed to know if sitting in a garden designed by Daniel Holt, watching Daniel Holt smile at his new beginning, would find that ache and wake it back up. She had searched herself in the car on the way back, and she had looked for it with the careful honesty of a woman who respects herself enough not to lie to herself about what she finds. And it was not there. There was something else in its place, something she had not anticipated quite in this form, quieter than she expected, warmer, something that felt like standing on solid ground and knowing precisely how you got there, and understanding that the ground is yours in a way that cannot be transferred or managed or signed away at a marble table. It felt like completion, not triumph, which is loud and requires witnesses. Completion, which is private and permanent and does not need anyone else in the room. She called her mother, who answered on the second ring, because Elena's mother always answered on the second ring as though she had been waiting. Though she would deny this with conviction. Her mother asked how it was. Elena looked at the skyline. She said, "He wanted me to see what moving on looks like." She paused. She said, "I think I showed him." A longer pause, and then I came home to mine. Her mother said nothing for a moment, and in that silence Elena could feel the particular maternal quality of being known by someone who has watched you become yourself across the full span of your life, and has never once stopped paying attention. Then her mother said, "Yes, baby," and that was enough. There is a particular kind of success that has nothing to do with numbers, though Elena Cross's numbers by that October were extraordinary. There is a kind of becoming that the people who most needed to diminish you will never fully understand, because they were only ever looking for evidence of your breaking, and your wholeness does not fit the story they need to tell. Daniel Holt had sent that invitation because he wanted her to see what he had built. What he did not know, what he could not have known from the position he had occupied for 12 years, was that Elena had been building in the dark for a long time before the lights came on. She had been building in the notebook in the back of her closet and in the ideas she kept private and in the $40,000 she had set aside in careful increments and in the phone calls she had made to people who had shaken her hand at his dinners and had walked away thinking that the most interesting person in the room had been standing slightly to the left of the person who was speaking. She had not built her company out of revenge. She would tell you that clearly and mean it. Revenge requires a sustained investment of your attention in the direction of someone else, and Elena had not had attention to spare for that. She had built her company because she had always been the kind of person who needed to build things and had spent 12 years in a situation that discouraged her from building anything she could claim. She had built it because the ideas in her notebook were good and because she had the skill to execute them, and because the morning after she signed her name on a marble table and smiled a real smile at a man who did not understand what she was smiling about, she had woken up in her life for the first time in a very long time. The most powerful response to someone who expects your pain is the full and unapologetic fact of your piece. Not performed, not narrated, not arranged for their viewing. Just real and present and entirely your own. Elena Cross did not compete with Daniel Holt. She did not attempt to wound him or outlast him or reduce him to anything smaller than what he was. She simply became what she had always had the capacity to be, and she allowed the fact of it to speak in its own time and in its own language. That is not a small thing. For a woman who had spent 12 years in a space designed to keep her invisible, showing up whole is an act of extraordinary courage. Leaving whole is an act of wisdom. And building, in the years that follow, something so unmistakably and completely yours that even the person who underestimated you most completely has to look at it with his own eyes and reckon with what he chose not to see. That is not revenge. That is something better. That is a life. If this story found you today, if it landed somewhere in you that recognized something in Elena's quiet, and her stillness and her willingness to leave everything at the table and walk out with only herself, drop a comment below and tell us what it brought up for you. And if you have ever been underestimated by someone who had the most access to your potential and chose not to invest in it, we want to hear from you. This community is built on stories like this one, on the truth that becoming is always still possible. We will see you in the next one.